Forgive from the heart. Well, last week I did, but today I'm mad again. I'm in pain again. So, was I faking it before? Why didn't it take? Will I be judged because I can't seem to stick the landing? It is so awful to hear the concluding thought of the gospel reading today. And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from the heart. Mercy. Jesus in Matthew's gospel is a man of hyperbole. It's his favorite device to get a point across. If you take this Jesus in Matthew at face value, it would be all bad news in some ways, because all this judgment and anger. If you see he's actually using exaggeration to free you, then it is actually good news. Jesus wants to free us from the world of just desserts. I'm not talking about cakes. I'm talking about a world of where everyone deserves what they get, where there are rules about what justice looks like. This is the world that Jesus wants to free us from, the world of just desserts. The world of just desserts is a world of transaction, not just economically, but in relationships. In this world, there are rules about what is appropriate and inappropriate. And there are consequences and measures for violations. Because in the world of just desserts, the world is supposed to make sense. Jesus throws all this into question throughout the Gospel of Matthew, but most especially in the Sermon on the Mount. If I were to rename this Sermon on the Mount, I would call it, "So You Think You're Good?" In this sermon, Jesus takes to task the rules of the world of just desserts. You have heard, he says, "Do not murder." But I say, if anyone is even angry with a brother or sister, they are liable to be condemned to hell. Or, Jesus says, you have heard, "Do not commit adultery." But I say, if your eye even wanders for a moment, you've already committed adultery. In other places, we hear Jesus also saying hyperbole. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Why is Jesus so out of proportion? It is because he is trying to unveil the ways we try to tell ourselves that by our own efforts, we are good people and therefore can feel satisfied. What he knows is that by our own efforts, we can't ever be good enough to free ourselves from our proclivity toward self-deception, hate in our hearts, and violence. The very people he is preaching to will be calling for his crucifixion. So you think you're good? Jesus says, think again. It is from the world of just desserts that Peter says or asks the question, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister? 7 times?" In the world of just desserts, 7 represents a complete and thorough sense. From the vantage point of the world of just desserts, Peter is being very good, very generous. But Jesus answers Peter from the world of grace. Not 7, Peter, but 77. I imagine Peter responding, well, what the heck is that? How can it be more than full and complete by my own effort? Jesus explains, well, let me tell you what the world of just desserts looks like from where I stand in the world of grace. Let me tell you a parable. There was a man, a king, who loaned a slave 10,000 talents. I know what you're thinking. 10,000 talents? That's more than 60 million denarii. The slave could never hope to pay it back. It would take 164,000 years for a slave to earn that much on a slave's wages. But even so, the slave got down on his knees and pleaded with the king, please give me more time and I promise I'll pay you back. Of course, the king knew he couldn't ever pay him back. But the king took pity on him. Instead of reducing his debt to something more realistic, the king canceled the entire thing. Amazing, right? Amazing. If we were all so lucky. Well, the slave later on comes upon another slave who owed him money, 100 denarii. Still pretty steep. That's 3.5 months of wages. The first slave remembers how he toiled for that money, how he put his family in jeopardy to lend this money to this slave, and how he trusted the slave because he was his friend. And oh, the memories of what he had to do to gain that money and then lend it out with trust and then was betrayed. It made him rageful. So he grabbed this second slave by the neck and said, give me my money, traitor. You promised. The second slave got down on his knees and begged him, please give me more time and I will repay you. The first slave knew this was a lie. He knew how hard it was to save that much money as a slave. There was no way. He was never going to see that money again. All that work in the fields, those days of privation, all that uncertainty, all the debts he had to avoid paying so that he could lend this to his friend. No, no, no. It was too much suffering, too much hardship. No, he refused. And he gave himself over to the violence of his heart, and this slave was thrown into jail, where he would stay until he could pay that debt. It was only fair. But the king heard about it. The king was a king of the kingdom of just desserts. He saw how egregious this violation was. And the king too was filled with rage. And he said to the slave, really? I canceled your entire enormous debt, and you still want to operate like life is normal? You still think that the rules apply, and you applied them to the other slave and condemned him to a life in prison? That's the world you want to choose to live in? Well, live in it. Not only will you be imprisoned for the rest of your life, you will be tortured. And needless to say, the slave was tortured for the rest of his miserable life in prison. I imagine then Jesus saying to Peter, "So Peter, where are you in the parable? Is a transactional forgiveness enough to protect you from the violence in your heart? Do you think you're that good?" This parable offers us two worlds to choose from: the world of just desserts and the world of grace. One world always leads to violence because it depends on our goodness, and we're just not that good. We all hold seeds of violence in our hearts, and it will surprise us when it will suddenly take root, sprout, and grow like a weed. It is how we respond to being in pain. And life has pain. One of the ways we manage this pain is to live in a world of consequences so that we can make sense of it. This happened, right? This happened, then that happened, and then that happened. And if this didn't happen, then this wouldn't have happened, and then I wouldn't be here in pain. I would be spared, and the ones I love would be spared, and then life would make sense. So who's responsible for all this pain? Who's gonna get their comeuppance? I have scoured my life with analysis, hoping to make sense of incredible pain and betrayal. But this has not freed me. Rather, it reiterates stories that heighten the pain. I didn't deserve this. I'm a good person. I did everything right, and it's not my fault. If you want to understand the torture that happens in the parable, all you have to do is run the scenarios over and over again of how you were wronged and how it doesn't make sense. This is the way it works in the world of just desserts. But thanks be to God, there is a world of grace. This is what we call the reign of God, where God is king. The only ticket for entry into this kingdom is this: no more explanations. You must surrender all your merit. This is non-transactional forgiveness. 77. Forever and ever and ever. Grace pouring over us like a waterfall. It takes some practice to get your bearings under the waterfall of grace. The reason we find ourselves forgiving and then feeling like it's not done is because living in the world of grace is a craft. It is a practice. We are all very well practiced in the world of just desserts. We've grown up with a very important salvation story of fairness. From this vantage point, the world of grace can even appear to be unjust and unrealistic. I mean, are we really going to let them off the hook? The transactional form of forgiveness demands that transformation happens first, and then forgiveness is counted out like dollar bills in measure. But the world of grace is non-transactional and gives forgiveness the way the planet gives us air. We don't deserve it. We need it. And in breathing, God breathes us. The good news for us who have sinned and for those who have sinned against us is that life doesn't have to change in order for us to be free. It doesn't mean that what has happened is good. Of course, it's not. We have had much that has happened to us that is incredibly painful. But the infection of sin doesn't have to infect our souls. And we don't have to perform the task of release by our own effort. It is God's grace that will help us grieve properly. From the world of grace, we can begin to repair the world without extending more pain and violence forward. But the path of grace is a narrow path. It takes some practice. It takes yearning to find this path. And the practice of walking this path is the daily and hourly choice of saying yes, and then surrendering to the mercy of God. But even though this path is narrow, it is for you. It is there for you, and you can take it. Will you take it today? Amen.